This is also a time of change for my family.
Buckingham Palace had never truly known peace since King Charles III ascended the throne. But this time, the threat came from the very woman who stood beside him, Queen Camilla. Everything began when Charles secretly met with a former trusted courtier of Queen Elizabeth II. She handed the king a sealed envelope containing a secret agreement signed shortly after he married Camilla, an agreement that strictly forbade her from interfering in the line of succession, building her own faction, or taking control of power inside the royal family. What terrified Charles was what he discovered next. Loyal staff members were suddenly disappearing. Private meetings were being held behind closed doors, and a hidden network of influence appeared to be quietly growing around Camilla. Had King Charles III already lost control inside his own palace? Exactly 2 weeks ago, London was being torn apart by one of the most violent rainstorms the city had seen in months. The streets surrounding Buckingham Palace were nearly empty, the iron gates glistening beneath flashes of lightning, the wind howling through the darkness like a warning no one wanted to hear. And then, at precisely 11:47 p.m., palace security spotted something moving through the rain. At first, it looked like an ordinary figure, an elderly woman, soaked from head to toe, her thin coat whipping violently in the storm as she stumbled toward the main gate. Her silver hair clung to her face. Her hands were shaking. But the closer she came, the more the guards realized this was no confused tourist and no harmless visitor. There was urgency in her eyes, fear, desperation, and something else, something that immediately made the entire security team tense. Then she screamed, "Open the gate right now. I have information about Queen Camilla. This is a matter of life and death for the royal family. I need to see King Charles III immediately." Her voice cut through the storm so sharply that even the guards standing under the stone archway froze for a moment before rushing forward. 2 officers in red ceremonial uniforms moved into position, rifles secured tightly across their chests as one of them shouted through the rain, "Step away from the gate immediately. This is a restricted royal zone. Leave now." But the woman didn't move, not even an inch. Instead, she gripped the cold iron bars with both hands, her knuckles turning white as rain poured down her face. Her breathing was heavy. Her voice shook, but not from fear. "I'm not insane," she shouted back. "My name is Margaret Thompson. I served Queen Elizabeth II for 12 years as her private secretary, and if you don't let me see the king tonight, this family will collapse from the inside." The guards exchanged glances instantly. One of them reached for his radio without saying a word. The other kept his eyes locked on Margaret, studying every movement, every word, every expression. Because people do not arrive at Buckingham Palace in the middle of the storm claiming to carry secrets from the late Queen unless something is terribly wrong. Within 4 minutes, palace security footage had already been forwarded upstairs, and moments later, one of Charles's most trusted personal aides appeared at the entrance. His expression calm at first, until he heard Margaret's name. Everything changed. Witnesses say the color drained from his face almost instantly. Without asking another question, he turned sharply and disappeared back inside the palace at nearly a run. Upstairs inside his private study, Charles sat alone beneath the soft golden light of an antique desk lamp, a cup of tea untouched beside him. The silence of the room broken only by rain striking the windows. It had already been a long day of meetings, briefings, and endless responsibilities. But when his aide stepped inside, bowed, and quietly whispered what was happening at the gate, Charles's entire expression changed. He slowly set down his cup, his eyes narrowed, and after several seconds of complete silence, he gave only one order: "Bring her to me now." But what Margaret Thompson carried inside that weathered leather bag would force the king to question not only his marriage, but everything he thought he knew about the woman sitting beside his throne. And what Charles was about to read had been hidden for nearly 20 years. Margaret Thompson was not brought through the main entrance. Under direct orders from King Charles III, she was escorted through a narrow side corridor deep inside Buckingham Palace, away from cameras, away from staff, and away from anyone who might ask questions. Rainwater still dripped from her coat onto the red carpet as palace security followed several steps behind, their faces tense, their movements unusually silent. By the time she reached the small private reception room, her hands were still trembling, but not from the cold. She had been carrying the secret for years. And tonight, she was finally about to deliver it. When the door opened, Charles stepped inside alone. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slightly heavy beneath the weight of the crown, but his eyes were sharp, focused entirely on the woman standing before him. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence inside that room felt almost unbearable. Then Charles finally broke it. "Who are you, and what do you know about Queen Camilla?" Margaret immediately dropped to one knee, her voice trembling but firm. "Your Majesty, my name is Margaret Thompson. I served Queen Elizabeth II for 12 years as her private secretary, and before Her Majesty passed away, she gave me one final mission." Charles didn't move, didn't blink. Margaret slowly opened the old leather bag she carried to the storm and carefully pulled out a thick, faded yellow envelope, its edges worn with age, its royal seal still untouched. The moment Charles saw the seal, his expression changed, because he recognized it immediately. It belonged to his mother. Margaret held the envelope out with both hands. "Her Majesty told me, if the time of transition ever came and if Camilla began to act, I was to place this directly into your hands." For the first time that night, Charles's fingers shook. He took the envelope slowly, carefully breaking the old seal, as if he already feared what he might find inside. Then he opened the document and began reading. Line by line, his face grew colder. Line by line, his breathing became heavier. And by the time he reached the final page, the room had gone completely silent. The document was a private agreement signed in 2005, shortly after Charles married Camilla, a confidential commitment personally ordered by Queen Elizabeth herself. It stated clearly that Camilla Parker Bowles would never interfere in the line of succession, never build private factions inside the palace, never control royal finances, never influence key appointments, and never attempt to become a power behind the throne. Her role was ceremonial only. Charles looked up slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "My mother made her sign this?" Margaret nodded, tears filling her eyes. "Her Majesty once told me Camilla would never be satisfied standing in the shadows." Those words hit Charles harder than anything he had read on that paper. He slowly lowered the document, his jaw tightening as years of memories, sacrifices, and loyalty seemed to collide all at once inside his mind. The woman he had defended before the world, the woman he had fought for, the woman he had placed beside the throne, was now at the center of something his own mother had feared nearly 20 years ago. Charles walked toward the window, staring into the rain-covered darkness outside, without saying a word. His grip on the document tightened, so hard the paper began to crease in his hand. Then Margaret spoke again, and this time her voice was even quieter. "Your Majesty, the agreement isn't the worst part." Charles turned slowly. Margaret looked directly into his eyes. "She's already begun violating every single line of it." And in that moment, Charles realized this was no longer suspicion. This was war, because what Margaret revealed next would prove that Queen Camilla wasn't simply breaking an old promise. She was quietly building her own kingdom inside his palace. Charles stood motionless, the faded agreement still clenched tightly in his hand. His eyes locked on Margaret Thompson as the rain continued striking the tall palace windows behind him. For several long seconds, he said nothing. No anger, no disbelief, just silence. The kind of silence that comes when a man realizes a truth may be far worse than the suspicion that brought him here. Then, slowly, King Charles III lifted his eyes and asked the one question he was almost afraid to hear answered. "What exactly has she done?" Margaret took a slow breath. Her hands were still shaking, but her voice had become steadier now, almost as if years of fear were finally leaving her body one word at a time. "Your Majesty, for the past 6 months, Queen Camilla has not been waiting, she's been moving." Charles's expression hardened instantly. Margaret stepped closer and lowered her voice. It started quietly. Small personnel changes. People loyal to Queen Elizabeth II were suddenly asked to retire early. Others were transferred without explanation. Some were removed overnight. At first, no one questioned it. They thought it was simply part of a new reign. She paused. But then the pattern became impossible to ignore. Charles said nothing. He simply listened. Margaret continued. Your communications advisors, your finance staff, your scheduling office, one by one. People who served your mother with absolute loyalty began disappearing. And every replacement had one connection in common. Charles already knew the answer before she said it. Camilla. Margaret nodded. She never appeared directly, never signed anything, never attended the official meetings. On paper, she wasn't there. But behind every decision, behind every transfer, behind every new appointment, the same name kept appearing. Charles's jaw tightened. Rebecca. Margaret looked stunned for a moment. You already know about her. Charles slowly turned toward the fireplace, his face darker now. Rebecca had been Camilla's personal assistant for years. Quiet, efficient, invisible, the kind of person no one ever noticed until it was too late. Margaret reached into her leather bag again and pulled out a small notebook, worn with age but carefully protected. These are names, dates, private meetings, internal movements, everything I've been tracking since Her Majesty passed. Charles took the notebook. As he turned the pages, his blood ran cold. Meeting after meeting, advisor after advisor, private dinners, unrecorded gatherings, financial reviews, personnel changes, communications briefings, even charity board restructures. And in nearly every entry, Rebecca's name appeared as coordinator. Not once, not twice, but dozens of times. Charles looked up slowly. How far has this gone? Margaret's answer came without hesitation. Farther than you think. She took another breath. Whenever you leave for Scotland, whenever you travel to Windsor Castle, whenever you attend private state meetings, closed-door gatherings begin inside the palace. Camilla's people meet with senior advisors, fund managers, communication staff, and every meeting ends the same way. Charles stepped closer. What do they want? Margaret's eyes filled with fear. Control. The word hit the room like thunder. Control of royal finances. Control of your schedule, control of media access, control of the advisors who will remain when Prince William becomes king. Charles's breathing became heavier. For the first time that night, real pain showed in his eyes. Not political pain, not institutional concern, personal pain, betrayal. The woman he had defended for decades, the woman he had sacrificed public trust for, the woman he had fought to place beside his throne, might be quietly preparing for life after him. Margaret lowered her voice even further. Your Majesty, Camilla doesn't want to be queen in title alone. She looked directly into his eyes. She wants to remain the real power, even after your son takes the crown. The room went silent. Charles slowly closed the notebook. His knuckles turned white. Then, after several long seconds, he spoke in a voice Margaret would later say she had never heard before. Cold, calm, dangerous. If what you're saying is true. He looked straight toward the darkness beyond the palace windows. Then tonight this stops. But Charles had no idea, even as he stood there preparing for war. Camilla had already begun making moves of her own. That same night, while King Charles III sat alone inside his private study, reading Margaret's notebook for the third time and forcing himself to accept that the woman beside his throne might also be the greatest threat to everything his mother had built, another set of decisions was already being made elsewhere. And according to sources familiar with the movements inside Buckingham Palace during those tense hours, Queen Camilla had already sensed that something had changed. She didn't know exactly what Charles knew, not yet, but she knew the atmosphere around her was no longer the same. It started the next morning at breakfast. For years, their routine had barely changed. Silver trays, fresh tea, quiet conversation, light discussion about upcoming tours, public appearances, and official meetings. But this time, something felt different the moment Charles entered the room. He didn't smile. He didn't ask about her evening. He didn't even look at her the way he normally did. Instead, he sat down slowly, unfolded the morning papers, and remained completely silent. Camilla noticed immediately. According to one palace servant who later described the scene, Camilla's expression changed for only a second. But in that second, something colder appeared behind her usual warmth. Something calculating, something watchful, "Sleep well?" she asked softly, cutting into her breakfast as if nothing had changed. Charles looked up for just a moment. "Well enough." That was all he said. But for Camilla, it was enough, because by midday, she had already begun asking questions. Quiet questions, careful questions, questions designed not to attract attention. She asked one staff member whether Charles had taken any private calls the previous night. She asked another if anyone had entered through the E-security gate after midnight. She asked Rebecca if there had been any unusual movement inside the private residence. And when the answers began coming back, her face reportedly grew colder with every passing minute. Then came the name that changed everything: Margaret Thompson. The moment Camilla heard it, witnesses say she went completely silent. No reaction, no visible anger, no panic, just silence. The kind of silence that frightened people far more than shouting ever could. Because Camilla remembered Margaret. She remembered exactly who she was. And more importantly, she remembered what Margaret knew. That night, inside her private suite at Clarence's house, Camilla didn't sleep. She sat alone beneath the warm glow of a golden lamp, one hand wrapped tightly around a glass she never touched, her jaw clenched so tightly that one palace maid later claimed she looked like a completely different person. Gone was the graceful smile. Gone was the soft public image. What remained was pure calculation. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., she made the call, not through palace lines, not through official channels. A private phone, one number, one person. Rebecca. When Rebecca answered, Camilla didn't waste a single second. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice low and ice cold. "I want a full list of everyone still loyal to Charles, and I want it before sunrise." Rebecca hesitated. "Your Majesty, if we move now, people will notice." Camilla's voice became even colder. "Then let them notice." The line went silent, and within hours, orders began moving to the palace like poison. Senior advisors were suddenly informed of early retirement. Communication staff were quietly reassigned. Financial consultants found their access suspended without explanation. Security clearances were reviewed. Meetings were canceled. Offices were locked. Phones stopped working. And by sunrise, more than a dozen people who had served the crown for decades were being pushed out without warning. But Camilla believed she was moving first. She believed she was protecting herself. She believed Charles still had no evidence. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that most of the people she had just tried to remove had already been quietly approached by Charles the night before. And instead of disappearing, they were walking straight into the king's private office, carrying emails, recordings, meeting notes, and enough evidence to destroy everything Camilla had spent months building in complete silence. By the time the sun rose over Buckingham Palace, King Charles III was no longer chasing suspicion. He was preparing for a confrontation. And before the next 24 hours were over, one dinner inside Buckingham Palace would change the future of a monarchy forever. By the following evening, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace had become almost unbearable. Staff moved through the corridors in complete silence. Doors closed more softly. Conversation stopped the moment footsteps approached. Everyone could feel it. Something was coming. Something that could change the future of the monarchy forever. And at the center of it all, seated beneath the glow of a crystal chandelier in the palace's private dining room, sat King Charles III and Queen Camilla, facing each other in a silence heavier than words. Dinner began like any other. Silver cutlery, crystal glasses, perfectly measured conversation. But this time, Charles wasn't here as a husband. He was here as a king. And according to those closest to the event of that night, the evidence sitting inside his private study, only a few rooms away, had already removed every remaining doubt from his mind. Emails, recordings, signed statements, financial records, internal transfers, private meetings, months of carefully hidden moves, all leading back to one person. Camilla noticed the change immediately. She smiled, but this time, Charles didn't smile back. Instead, he calmly set down his knife and fork, looked directly into her eyes, and asked one simple question. "Camilla, how many meetings has Rebecca arranged on your behalf?" For the first time that evening, Camilla froze, only for a second, but Charles saw it. And in that moment, He knew everything. What happened next would remain hidden from the public. But according to multiple insiders, it was one of the most painful private confrontations in modern royal history. Voices were raised. Old wounds reopened. Years of trust collapsed in a matter of minutes. And when Charles finally placed a thick dossier on the table, complete with recordings, statements, and the original 2005 agreement signed under the authority of Queen Elizabeth II, Camilla reportedly went completely silent. No denial, no anger, no explanation, just silence. Because for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the game was over. By sunrise the next morning, palace orders were already being carried out. Advisors loyal to the late Queen quietly returned to their positions. Private networks were dismantled. Internal communications were restored. Rebecca and several trusted aides disappeared from royal operations almost overnight. And according to insiders, Camilla herself was quietly moved away from key palace decisions under the official explanation of private rest and recovery. But for Charles, there was no victory in any of it, only heartbreak. Because in saving the crown, he may have lost a woman he once risked everything to place beside it. And perhaps that is what makes this story so haunting. Sometimes the greatest threat to a kingdom does not come from enemies outside the gates, but from the people sitting closest to the throne. So if you were King Charles III, what would you choose? Love or duty? Marriage or the monarchy? The person beside you, or the family legacy built for generations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy royal stories filled with secrets, power, betrayal, and hidden palace truths, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because the next royal secret may already be unfolding behind closed doors. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.